The judge looked at me over her reading glasses, her expression somewhere between curiosity and concern, and asked the question that would change everything. Why are you filing a criminal complaint against your own parents, Miss Chan? My mother's perfectly manicured hand flew to her chest in a gesture of wounded innocence while my father's jaw clenched so tightly, I could see the muscle twitching beneath his expensive cologne-scented skin. But when I opened my leather portfolio and began laying out the documents on the table, one by one, photograph after bank statement after forged signature, I watched the color drain from their faces like water circling a drain. My father was the first to move, his chair scraping against the courtroom floor as he grabbed my mother's arm, and they both turned toward the exit, their designer shoes clicking frantically against the marble, their panic so palpable you could taste it in the air like copper pennies on your tongue. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Chen. I am 29 years old, and until 6 months ago, I believed my parents were respected philanthropists who had built their fortune through hard work and legitimate business ventures. I believed the story they told everyone at charity galas and country club dinners about immigrating to America with nothing, and building an empire through determination and sacrifice. I believed I was the ungrateful daughter who had disappointed them by choosing to become a forensic accountant, instead of joining their real estate development company, like they had planned for me since childhood. I believed so many things that turned out to be lies constructed as carefully as the McMansions my parents built in gated communities across Northern California. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand why I was standing in a San Francisco courtroom on a Tuesday morning in October, presenting evidence that would send my own parents to federal prison, you need to understand how I got here. You need to know about the woman I was before I discovered the truth, and the long, painful journey that transformed me from obedient daughter to the person who would ultimately bring down the people who gave me life. Growing up, I was what everyone called a model child. I maintained a perfect grade point average throughout high school, served as student body president, volunteered at the local hospital on weekends, and got accepted to Stanford University with a full academic scholarship. My parents displayed my achievements like trophies in their Palo Alto mansion, pointing to my success as evidence of their excellent parenting and superior family values. "Look at what we built," my mother would say to her friends over champagne brunches, gesturing at me as though I were another luxury item they had acquired. My father would put his hand on my shoulder at business dinners and tell potential investors that I was going to join Chin Development Corporation after graduation and help take the company to the next level. It never occurred to either of them to ask what I actually wanted. The truth was that I found real estate development mind-numbingly boring. The endless discussions about zoning laws and construction permits and profit margins made my eyes glaze over. What fascinated me was finding patterns in numbers, following trails of financial transactions, understanding how money moved through systems, and what those movements revealed about human behavior. I loved the detective work of accounting, the way a careful examination of spreadsheets could tell you more about a person's true character than any words they spoke. My parents viewed this interest with barely concealed contempt. Why would you want to be an accountant when you could be running a multimillion-dollar company? My mother asked when I told her I wanted to major in accounting. That is work for people who are not smart enough to build businesses themselves. People who work for other people instead of being leaders. But I persisted anyway, choosing to major in accounting with a specialization in forensic analysis despite my parents' vocal disappointment. I graduated with honors, passed my CPA exam on the first attempt, and got hired by Morrison & Associates, a forensic accounting firm in San Francisco that specialized in fraud investigation and litigation support. The work was exactly what I had hoped for: intellectually challenging and morally satisfying. We helped lawyers build cases against corporate criminals, traced money through elaborate shell company structures, and testified in court about financial irregularities that revealed theft, embezzlement, and fraud. I was good at it, good enough that I made senior associate within 3 years, which was almost unheard of at a firm where most people spent 5 or 6 years before getting promoted. My parents attended my promotion celebration dinner with expressions that suggested they were being forced to eat spoiled food. They made polite conversation with my colleagues but left early, claiming they had an important business meeting the next morning. In the parking lot afterward, my mother pulled me aside while my father went to get their Mercedes. "Elena," she said quietly, Her voice tight with something I could not quite identify. When are you going to stop playing these little games and come work for the family business? You are 26 years old. It is time to stop pretending to be independent and accept your responsibilities to this family. I am not pretending, I told her, keeping my voice even despite the anger rising in my chest. This is my career. This is what I am good at and what I love doing. Why can you not be happy that I am successful? She looked at me with an expression that was part pity and part disgust. You call this successful? You make what, $100,000 a year investigating other people's businesses like some kind of spy? Your father and I made more than that in a week when we were your age. You have so much potential, Elena, and you are wasting it trying to prove some childish point about independence. Her hand touched my cheek in what might have looked like affection to an outside observer but felt like possession. Come home. Work with us. Build something that matters instead of tearing down what other people built. That conversation happened on a Friday evening in June. By Monday morning, I had convinced myself that my mother's words came from a place of caring rather than control, that maybe she was right about my choices being driven more by rebellion than genuine passion. I spent the next week feeling uncertain about everything I had built, questioning whether my career path was really what I wanted, or just a way of proving I did not need my parents' approval. Then I got assigned to the Blackwell Properties case and everything changed. Blackwell Properties was a real estate development company based in Sacramento that was being sued by a group of homeowners who claimed the company had used substandard materials in constructing their houses, resulting in structural problems, mold infestations, and rapidly declining property values. The homeowners had hired a lawyer who specialized in construction defect litigation, and that lawyer had hired our firm to examine Blackwell's financial records and determine whether there was evidence of intentional fraud, rather than simple negligence or contractor incompetence. I was assigned to the case along with 2 other senior associates because of my experience with real estate accounting and my track record of finding financial irregularities that others missed. The work was tedious at first, combing through thousands of invoices and purchase orders and bank statements, looking for patterns or anomalies that might indicate deliberate corner-cutting or fraudulent billing practices. Blackwell Properties had been in business for 23 years, and had developed dozens of residential communities throughout Northern California, which meant there was an enormous volume of financial data to analyze. Most of it appeared completely legitimate on the surface. Materials were purchased from reputable suppliers at reasonable prices. Contractors were paid amounts that seemed consistent with industry standards. Building permits were obtained properly and inspections were passed without notable issues. But something nagged at me as I reviewed the documents. There were small inconsistencies that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested a pattern. Certain suppliers appeared repeatedly in the records despite being located far from the construction sites, which seemed inefficient and unusual. Some contractors received payments that were just slightly higher than what other contractors charged for similar work. And there were periodic wire transfers to a consulting company called Pacific Advisory Services that provided no detailed invoices explaining what services had been rendered to justify payments that sometimes exceeded $50,000. I spent a week investigating Pacific Advisory Services and discovered it was a shell company with no employees, no office, and no apparent business operations beyond receiving wire transfers from Blackwell Properties. The company had been registered in Delaware, which is common for businesses seeking privacy and favorable corporate laws, but the registered agent was a service that specialized in helping people create anonymous business entities. Every trail I followed led to another dead end. Another layer of corporate structure designed to obscure who actually controlled Pacific Advisory Services, and what happened to the money that flowed into its accounts. Then I found the signature. It was on a bank document authorizing the opening of a business account for Pacific Advisory Services. A single page buried in thousands of other pages of financial records that I had requested through legal discovery. The signature was supposed to belong to someone named Michael Torres, who was listed as the president of Pacific Advisory Services. But I recognized that signature immediately because I had seen it on birthday cards and permission slips, and countless other documents throughout my entire childhood. The handwriting was distinctive, with a particular flourish on the capital letters and a specific way of crossing the T that was impossible to mistake. It was my father's signature. My hand started shaking as I stared at that document, my mind racing through implications I did not want to accept. There had to be an innocent explanation. Maybe my father had helped someone set up a business and sign documents on their behalf. Maybe it was a bizarre coincidence that this Michael Torres person had handwriting identical to my father's. Maybe I was wrong about the signature match and was seeing patterns that did not actually exist because I was stressed and overworked. But forensic accountants are trained to follow evidence, rather than assumptions or preferences. So I did what I was trained to do. I pulled up samples of my father's signature from public documents, business filings for Chun Development Corporation, property deeds, loan applications. I compared them systematically to the signature on the Pacific Advisory Services bank account authorization. I measured the angles and spacing and unique characteristics. And then I consulted with a handwriting expert who confirmed what I already knew, but desperately did not want to believe. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The signatures were identical. My father had created Pacific Advisory Services. And if my father had created a shell company that was receiving payments from Blackwell Properties, that meant my father was somehow connected to Blackwell Properties, which meant the fraud I was investigating might somehow involve my own family. I spent 3 days barely eating or sleeping, pulling every piece of public information I could find about Blackwell Properties and Chun Development Corporation, looking for connections that might explain the relationship. On the surface, the companies appeared completely separate. They operated in different markets, had different ownership structures, and had never been mentioned together in any public documents. But as I dug deeper into the corporate structures and followed the ownership chains through multiple layers of holding companies and limited partnerships, I found it. Buried beneath 4 levels of corporate entities was a limited liability company that owned 20% of Blackwell Properties. And that limited liability company was wholly owned by another entity that was in turn controlled by a trust. A trust that listed my mother as the primary beneficiary and my father as the trustee. My parents did not just know the people running Blackwell Properties. They were silent partners in the company. They were profiting from the fraud that had devastated those homeowners who thought they were buying well-constructed houses in safe communities. And they had created an elaborate corporate structure specifically designed to hide that relationship from public scrutiny. I sat in my apartment that night, surrounded by printouts and documents, trying to understand what I was seeing. My parents were wealthy, legitimately wealthy from their own real estate development company that built upscale properties for affluent buyers. Why would they risk everything to be involved with a company like Blackwell that was cutting corners and defrauding working-class families who could barely afford their mortgages? What possible motivation could justify this kind of behavior? Then I started investigating Chun Development Corporation itself, applying the same forensic accounting techniques I had been using on Blackwell Properties. I requested public records, pulled building permits, examined contractor payments, traced material purchases. And I found the same patterns. The same shell companies receiving consulting fees. The same inflated contractor payments that suggested kickbacks. The same suppliers located suspiciously far from construction sites. My parents had not gotten involved with Blackwell's fraud scheme. Blackwell had learned the fraud scheme from my parents. Chun Development Corporation had been built on the same foundation of substandard materials, inflated costs, and hidden profits that I had been hired to expose at Blackwell Properties. Everything I had believed about my family was a lie. The immigrant success story was real enough. My parents had come to America from Taiwan with very little money, and had worked multiple jobs to save enough capital to start their first small development project. But somewhere along the way, probably early on when they were struggling to compete with established developers who had more resources and connections, they had made a choice. They had decided that success mattered more than integrity, that wealth justified any methods used to acquire it, that the rules other people followed were obstacles for suckers rather than ethical guidelines that applied to everyone. And they had built their entire fortune, the mansion I grew up in, the private schools they sent me to, the luxury cars and country club memberships and European vacations, all of it was built on stealing from people who trusted them to build safe homes for their families. I spent a week in a state of shock, going through the motions at work while my mind obsessed over what I had discovered. I considered confronting my parents directly, demanding explanations, hoping there was some context I was missing that would make this less horrible than it appeared. But I was a forensic accountant. I knew that confronting suspects before gathering all evidence usually just gave them time to destroy records and create alibis. If I was going to do this, if I was going to expose my own parents' crimes, I needed to be thorough and methodical and absolutely certain of my facts. So I kept investigating. I pulled every public record I could access legally. I examined every document related to Chun Development Corporation's projects over the past 20 years. I traced money through shell companies and offshore accounts. I documented patterns of fraud that went back to before I was born. And with each new piece of evidence I uncovered, I felt something inside me dying. Not just my relationship with my parents, though that was certainly dying, but some fundamental belief I had held about the world, about justice, about whether good people existed or whether everyone was just pretending to be decent while secretly doing terrible things when they thought no one was watching. After 6 weeks of investigation, I had compiled a dossier of evidence that documented systematic fraud across at least 37 different development projects spanning 2 decades. I had proof of building code violations, use of substandard materials, fraudulent inspection reports, bribery of local officials, and an elaborate money laundering scheme that hid profits in offshore accounts while reporting minimal taxable income. The estimated damages to homeowners who had purchased properties from Chen Development Corporation exceeded $40 million. The amount of tax fraud probably exceeded another $20 million. This was not a case of a few mistakes or shortcuts. This was organized, systematic, ongoing criminal enterprise. I did not tell anyone at my firm what I had found, not initially. I was not assigned to investigate Chun Development Corporation. I had pulled those records and done that analysis on my own time using my own resources. Ethically and legally, I was in complicated territory. Could I use information I had gathered about my own family in a professional capacity? Would doing so create conflicts of interest or attorney-client privilege issues? I consulted with a legal ethics attorney who specialized in professional responsibility issues, explaining my situation hypothetically at first, and then, when I trusted her enough, telling her the whole truth. Her advice was clear. I had not just the right but the obligation to report what I had found. The fraud I had documented was ongoing, which meant more families were being victimized every day that I remained silent. The fact that the perpetrators were my parents did not create any legal obligation to protect them from consequences of their criminal behavior. And if I chose to remain silent, I would be complicit in ongoing fraud, which could cost me my professional license and potentially result in criminal charges for obstruction of justice or being an accessory after the fact. She also warned me that what I was about to do would destroy my family relationships permanently and irrevocably. My parents would view this as the ultimate betrayal. My extended family would likely take their side, viewing me as disloyal and vindictive regardless of the evidence I presented. I would probably be written out of wills, excluded from family gatherings, and treated as though I had died. I needed to be prepared for that emotional cost before taking action I could never undo. I thought about her warning for exactly one night. Then I called the district attorney's office in San Francisco and requested a meeting with someone in the white-collar crime division. 2 days later, I sat in a conference room in a government building downtown and presented my evidence to an assistant district attorney named Rebecca Walsh and an FBI agent named Daniel Park who specialized in financial crimes. I gave them copies of everything I had compiled, walked them through the patterns I had identified, and explained the corporate structures my parents had created to hide their activities. Rebecca and Daniel listened with expressions that shifted from skeptical to shocked to grimly satisfied as I presented my findings. When I finished, Rebecca looked at me carefully and asked the question I had been dreading. "Miss Chun, do you understand that this evidence will almost certainly result in criminal charges against your parents? That they will likely face federal prison time if convicted? That you will probably need to testify against them in court?" "I understand," I said quietly, "and I am prepared to do whatever is necessary to hold them accountable for what they have done." Daniel leaned forward. "Why are you doing this? I mean, I am glad you are, but most people do not turn in their own parents regardless of what crimes they discover. What made you decide to come forward?" I thought about his question, trying to articulate something I had been wrestling with for weeks. "Because hundreds of families trusted my parents to build safe homes for them," I said finally. "Because those families are struggling with repairs they cannot afford and property values that have collapsed and health problems from mold and structural issues. Because my parents looked those people in the eye and lied to them, took their money, and gave them houses that were literally falling apart while my parents lived in a mansion and drove luxury cars. Because if I stay silent, I am telling those families that my relationship with my parents matters more than justice, more than what is right, more than their suffering. And I cannot live with that. I will not be the kind of person who looks the other way when people I love do terrible things to other people. Rebecca nodded slowly. Okay. We are going to need several weeks to verify your findings and build a prosecutable case. During that time, you cannot contact your parents or anyone else in your family about this investigation. Can you do that? I can do that, I agreed. And so began the strangest 3 months of my life. I continued working at Morrison & Associates, handling my normal caseload, attending meetings, going through the routines of everyday professional life, while knowing that in conference rooms across the city, prosecutors and FBI agents were building a case against my parents based on evidence I had provided. I avoided family gatherings by claiming I was busy with work, which was not entirely untrue. I did not return my mother's phone calls as frequently as I normally would have, and when I did talk to her, I kept conversations brief and superficial, terrified that something in my voice would betray what I knew and what I had done. My father called me one evening in December, which was unusual because he typically communicated through my mother. "Elena," he said when I answered, "your mother tells me you have been distant lately. Is something wrong? Are you having problems at work? Problems with a boyfriend? Whatever it is, you can talk to us. We are your parents. We love you and want to help." The concern in his voice sounded so genuine that for a moment I almost doubted everything I had discovered. Maybe I had made a mistake. Maybe I had misinterpreted the evidence. Maybe there was some explanation I had not considered that would make all of this make sense. But then I thought about the families living in houses with black mold growing in the walls, families spending money they did not have on repairs that should never have been necessary, families watching their largest investment crumble literally and financially while my father drove his Tesla and my mother bought art at charity auctions. "I am fine, Dad," I lied. "Just busy with a complicated case. I will have more time after the holidays. We will have dinner then." "We miss you," he said. "The house feels empty without you coming around. Your mother has been planning this elaborate Christmas celebration and she keeps asking if you will be there." "I will be there," I promised, though even as I said the words I knew it was probably not true. By Christmas my parents would likely be under arrest. And even if they were not, how could I sit at their table and eat their food and exchange presents while knowing what I knew? How could I pretend everything was normal when nothing would ever be normal again? The call from Rebecca Walsh came on January 4th, a Monday morning when I was reviewing documents for a case involving corporate tax evasion. "Can you come to my office this afternoon?" she asked. "We are ready to move forward and we need to brief you on what happens next." I met with Rebecca and Daniel that afternoon, along with 2 other FBI agents and a U.S. attorney who would be prosecuting the case in federal court. They explained that they had spent the past 3 months corroborating my findings, interviewing homeowners who had purchased properties from Chen Development Corporation, examining building records, and tracing the complex web of financial transactions through multiple jurisdictions. Everything I had documented was accurate and then some. They had found additional evidence of fraud that I had not discovered, including bribery of building inspectors and zoning officials, which elevated the charges from civil fraud to federal racketeering offenses. The plan was to arrest my parents simultaneously at their home on January 15th, early in the morning before they could be tipped off and potentially flee or destroy evidence. Federal agents would execute search warrants for their home, their offices, and their financial records. My parents would be taken into custody, processed, and brought before a federal magistrate for an initial appearance where they would be informed of the charges and conditions of release would be determined. "And here is where things get complicated for you," Rebecca said, looking at me with an expression that was sympathetic but firm. "Your parents are going to know immediately that someone provided evidence against them. The specificity of what we know, the documents we have, the timeline we can present, all of that points to someone with inside access to information. They will figure out it was you, probably within hours of being arrested. Are you prepared for that confrontation?" I thought I was prepared. I thought I had spent 3 months mentally and emotionally bracing myself for my parents to know what I had done, and to hate me for it. But when Rebecca asked the question directly, sitting in that conference room with federal prosecutors and FBI agents, I realized I had no idea what prepared actually meant in this context. How do you prepare for your parents to look at you with the knowledge that you destroyed their lives? How do you prepare to become the ultimate betrayer in their story? The villainous daughter who turned against her own family. But I nodded anyway. I am prepared, I said. And I will testify if the case goes to trial. That probably will not be necessary, the U.S. attorney said. The evidence is overwhelming. Most defendants in cases like this accept plea agreements rather than risk trial. Your parents will likely be offered a deal where they plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for cooperation in prosecuting other individuals who were involved in the fraud, such as contractors who provided kickbacks or officials who accepted bribes. But we need you to be ready to testify if they choose to fight the charges. I understand, I said. Whatever you need. The FBI arrested my parents on January 15th at 6:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because Rebecca called me at 6:50 to tell me it was done. Your parents are in custody, she said simply. They are being transported to the federal building for processing. The arraignment is scheduled for 2 o'clock this afternoon in Judge Patricia Morrison's courtroom. You do not need to be there, but you are welcome to attend if you want to. I did not want to attend. The thought of seeing my parents in that context, of watching them stand before a judge in handcuffs, was almost physically painful. But I went anyway because I needed to see this through. Needed to witness the consequences of my choices. Needed to understand that this was real and permanent, and could not be undone by wishful thinking or regret. The courtroom was nearly empty when I arrived. Just a few reporters who covered federal court proceedings regularly and some family members I did not recognize, probably people associated with other cases on the docket that afternoon. I sat in the back row, wearing sunglasses indoors like some kind of celebrity trying to avoid recognition, and waited for my parents to be brought in. When they finally appeared, escorted by federal marshals, they looked smaller than I remembered. My mother's perfectly styled hair was disheveled and her expensive makeup was smudged as though she had been crying. My father's shoulders were hunched forward in a posture of defeat I had never seen from him before. They wore the same clothes they had presumably been sleeping in when FBI agents knocked on their door that morning. My mother in silk pajamas that probably cost more than most people spent on an entire outfit. My father in a t-shirt and sweatpants that made him look ordinary rather than powerful. Their eyes scanned the courtroom as they were led to the defense table, and I knew the moment my mother saw me. Her entire body went rigid and her mouth opened in a small O of shock. She grabbed my father's arm and pointed in my direction. And then he was looking at me too. His expression cycling through confusion and recognition and understanding and finally rage so pure and intense that I could feel it from across the room like heat from a fire. The arraignment itself was brief and procedural. The charges were read. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bank fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The potential prison time if convicted on all charges was more than 30 years. My parents pleaded not guilty as expected, and the judge set bail at $2 million each, secured by property, and with conditions prohibiting them from leaving the state or contacting witnesses. The entire proceeding took less than 20 minutes. But before the judge could dismiss the case until the next hearing, my father stood up at the defense table. "Your Honor," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "I need to make a statement. This is all a terrible mistake. We have done nothing wrong. Someone has fabricated evidence against us. Someone with a grudge who wants to destroy our family. I demand that you investigate who brought these false charges and prosecute them for filing a fraudulent complaint." Judge Morrison looked at him with an expression that managed to be both patient and deeply unsympathetic. "Mr. Chun, your attorney can file any motions you believe are appropriate. But this is not the time or forum for those arguments. Please sit down." My father remained standing. "Your Honor, that someone is sitting in this courtroom right now. Our own daughter, Elena Chun, who works as a forensic accountant, has manufactured evidence against us because she is angry that we did not approve of her career choices. She has used her professional skills to create a completely false narrative of fraud that does not exist. I am asking you to investigate her for filing false charges and attempting to frame her own parents for crimes they did not commit." The judge's expression shifted to something harder. "Mr. Chun, I am not going to warn you again. Sit down. Your attorney can address these allegations through proper legal channels." But my father was not finished. He turned to look directly at me. his finger pointing accusingly. "You did this," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You vindictive, ungrateful child. After everything we gave you, everything we sacrificed for you, you destroy us with lies? You will regret this, Elena. You will spend the rest of your life regretting what you have done to this family." The marshals moved to restrain him, but before they could, my mother was on her feet too. "How could you?" she screamed at me, her voice raw with pain and fury. "We are your parents. We loved you. We gave you everything. And this is how you repay us? By making up stories and sending us to prison? You are dead to us. Do you hear me? Dead. We have no daughter." That was when they tried to run. In a moment that felt almost absurd in its desperation, my father grabbed my mother's hand and they both bolted toward the side door of the courtroom, the one that led to the hallway rather than back to the holding cells. The marshals caught them within seconds, of course. There was nowhere to go and no chance of escape. But the image of my parents attempting to flee, choosing flight over facing the consequences of their actions, was captured by the one news camera that had been present and would be played on local news broadcasts that evening. Judge Morrison called for order, and the marshals escorted my parents out of the courtroom, this time with much firmer grips on their arms. The judge looked at the prosecutors and said simply, "Make sure the defendants understand that any further outbursts will result in detention without bail pending trial." Then she looked directly at me, still sitting in the back row in my sunglasses, and gave me a slight nod that might have been acknowledgement or sympathy or simply recognition that she knew exactly who I was and what I had done. I walked out of the courthouse into the cold January afternoon and stood on the steps, breathing in air that tasted like rain and exhaust and something I could not quite name. Freedom, maybe. Or loss. Probably both simultaneously, tangled together in a way that could never be fully separated or resolved. My phone buzzed with a text message from Rebecca Walsh. "Are you okay?" That was intense. "I am okay," I texted back, though I was not sure if that was true. I was numb, which was different from okay, but perhaps the best I could manage in that moment. My parents' words echoed in my mind. "You are dead to us. We have no daughter." I had known they would hate me for what I had done, but hearing them say it out loud, seeing the genuine hatred and betrayal in their eyes, was more painful than any preparation could have mitigated. But I had done the right thing. That certainty was the foundation I built everything else on top of. My parents had defrauded hundreds of families, had stolen millions of dollars, had built their entire fortune on lies and exploitation and criminal behavior. They had made those choices freely and repeatedly over decades. I had not made them criminals. I had simply held them accountable for the crimes they had already committed. If that made me dead to them, if that cost me my family and my heritage and any sense of belonging to something larger than myself, well, that was the price of integrity. And it was a price I was willing to pay. I started walking toward the BART station, blending into the afternoon crowds of office workers and students and tourists, just another person navigating the city streets. Tomorrow I would return to work at Morrison & Associates, would resume handling my regular caseload, would try to rebuild some version of normal life. Next week I would probably need to find a therapist who specialized in family estrangement and moral injury. Next month I would have to testify before the grand jury that would formally indict my parents on all charges. But today, right now, I was just Elena Chun, 29 years old, walking through San Francisco on a cold January afternoon, carrying the weight of what I had done and the knowledge that sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything, but you do it anyway because the alternative, staying silent while people you love harm others, is a cost you are not willing to pay no matter how much it hurts to speak up. The story of how I got from that courthouse to where I am today. The story of trials and testimonies and rebuilding a life from the ashes of family bonds burned beyond recognition. That story is longer and more complicated. But it starts with that moment in Judge Morrison's courtroom when my parents asked why I was filing against them, and I showed them the evidence and they tried to run. It starts with the choice to value truth over loyalty, justice over family, integrity over comfort. And if I had to make that choice again, knowing everything I know now about the cost and the pain and the permanent loss, I would make the exact same decision. Because some things matter more than blood. And doing what is right, even when it destroys you, is one of those things. The morning after the arraignment, I woke up in my apartment to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. I lay in bed for several minutes before reaching for my phone, knowing that what I was about to see would be painful but needing to face it anyway. The messages were from relatives I had not spoken to in months, some in years, all of them saying essentially the same thing in varying degrees of anger and disbelief. My Aunt Linda, my mother's younger sister, had sent a message at 3 in the morning that simply read, "How could you betray your own blood?" My cousin Michael, who I had been close with growing up, sent something more elaborate about family loyalty being sacred and how I had destroyed any chance of reconciliation by my vindictive actions. My Uncle James, my father's brother who ran a small accounting firm in Sacramento, called me a traitor and said I had disgraced not just my parents but the entire Chin family name. The messages that hurt most came from my grandmother, my mother's mother who had immigrated to America in her 60s to be near her daughters. She was 84 years old now, living in a retirement community in San Jose that my parents paid for. Her English was limited, so her message was mostly in Mandarin, but the meaning was clear enough even before I translated it properly. She wrote that she had always been proud of me, proud of my education and my success, but that what I had done to my parents was unforgivable according to both American law and Chinese tradition. Children who turned against their parents were cursed, she said, and I would spend the rest of my life suffering for this choice. She ended the message by saying she never wanted to see me again, and that I should not come to her funeral when she died. I sat on the edge of my bed reading these messages, feeling something inside me that was not quite grief and not quite relief but rather a strange combination of both. I had known this would happen. I had known that choosing to prosecute my parents would mean losing my entire extended family, that blood ties would trump evidence and justice and any consideration of who was actually right or wrong in this situation. Asian families, particularly traditional immigrant families like mine, operated on principles of hierarchy and loyalty that superseded Western concepts of individual morality. Parents were to be respected and obeyed regardless of their actions. Children who challenged parental authority were rebellious and shameful, and children who actually reported parents to legal authorities were committing an act so transgressive that it essentially removed them from the family structure entirely. I had become that transgressive child, the one who valued American concepts of justice over Chinese concepts of filial piety, the one who believed that right and wrong mattered more than family cohesion. And now I was paying the price for that choice through a form of social death, being excommunicated from the community that had defined my identity for 29 years. I deleted all the messages without responding. What could I possibly say that would change anyone's mind? The evidence of my parents' crimes was overwhelming and documented and publicly available through court filings. Anyone who genuinely wanted to understand why I had taken this action could simply read the charges and examine the facts. But nobody in my family wanted to understand. They wanted me to recant, to admit I had made a terrible mistake, to beg my parents for forgiveness and somehow undo what I had set in motion. Since I could not and would not do any of those things, there was no conversation to be had. I got dressed and went to work, riding the BART train into the city just like I did every weekday morning, trying to pretend this was a normal day that would proceed according to normal routines. But when I arrived at Morrison & Associates at 8:15, I could immediately feel that something was different. The receptionist, usually warm and chatty, barely made eye contact when I walked past her desk. My colleague David, who typically stopped by my office first thing in the morning to discuss weekend activities or complain about difficult clients, walked straight past my door without acknowledging me. The senior partner, Thomas Morrison himself, sent me an email requesting a meeting in his office at 9 o'clock, which was unusual enough to make my stomach clench with anxiety. I spent the 45 minutes before that meeting trying to focus on work, reviewing documents for a case involving embezzlement at a nonprofit organization, but my mind kept drifting to what Thomas might want to discuss. Had my family contacted the firm to complain about me? Had clients expressed concerns about being represented by someone who had turned in her own parents? Was I about to be fired for bringing negative attention to the firm? At precisely 9 o'clock, I knocked on Thomas Morrison's door and entered his corner office with its views of the financial district and shelves lined with legal reference books. Thomas was in his early 60s, a tall man with silver hair and the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of experience in high-stakes litigation. He had founded Morrison & Associates 30 years ago, and had built it into one of the most respected forensic accounting firms in Northern California. He was also the person who had hired me straight out of university, who had mentored me through my early years at the firm, and who had promoted me to senior associate based on my track record of excellent work. He gestured for me to sit in one of the leather chairs across from his desk. His expression was difficult to read, somewhere between concerned and conflicted. Elena, he began, his voice careful and measured, I want to start by saying that what you did took extraordinary courage. Reporting your own parents for criminal activity, providing evidence that will likely send them to prison, that is not something most people would be capable of doing regardless of how clear the ethical obligation might be. I respect you for making that choice even though I imagine it has been incredibly difficult. I felt something loosen slightly in my chest. Thank you, I said quietly. It has been the hardest thing I have ever done. Thomas nodded. I am sure it has been. However, we need to discuss the implications this situation has for your position at this firm. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. We received several phone calls yesterday afternoon, and this morning from people identifying themselves as family members of yours. They made various allegations about your character, your professional conduct, and the validity of the evidence you provided to prosecutors. Some of them threatened to contact our clients to inform them that we employ someone who would betray her own family. One person, I believe your uncle, threatened to file a complaint with the State Board of Accountancy, alleging that you violated professional ethics rules. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Are you firing me? No, Thomas said firmly. We are not firing you. You have done nothing wrong professionally or ethically. In fact, you did exactly what our professional standards require, which is to report evidence of ongoing criminal activity to appropriate authorities. Any accountant who discovered what you discovered and failed to report, it would be violating their professional obligations. But I need you to understand that this situation is going to create complications for the firm. Some clients may be uncomfortable knowing about your family situation. Some potential clients may choose not to hire us because they worry about confidentiality or loyalty issues. Fair or not, you have become a controversial figure, and controversy affects business. I understand, I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear rising in my throat. What do you need me to do? Thomas leaned back in his chair. For now, I need you to keep your head down and continue doing excellent work. Do not engage with anyone from your family who contacts you about this situation. Do not speak to media if they reach out for comments. Let the legal process unfold without any additional drama or attention. If you do that, if you simply focus on being the outstanding forensic accountant you have always been, this will eventually blow over and become just an unfortunate situation in your past, rather than a defining characteristic of your professional identity. And if clients do leave because of me, if the firm loses business because of the controversy, then we deal with that if and when it happens, Thomas said. But Elena, I want to be very clear about something. This firm was built on principles of integrity and accountability. We investigate fraud. We expose criminal behavior. We help hold powerful people responsible for their actions. If we fire you for doing exactly that, even though the targets of your investigation happen to be your own parents, we would be massive hypocrites. I am not interested in being a hypocrite. So unless you do something that actually violates professional standards, your job is secure. Do you understand? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without my voice breaking. Thomas had just given me the validation I desperately needed, the confirmation that I had not destroyed my career along with my family relationships, that someone in a position of authority believed I had done the right thing rather than something shameful and wrong. Good, Thomas said, his tone becoming slightly warmer. Now get back to work. You have that nonprofit embezzlement case that needs your attention, and David mentioned you were helping him analyze some real estate transactions for the Henderson matter. Keep doing what you do best. The rest will sort itself out. I returned to my office feeling marginally better but still deeply shaken. The conversation with Thomas had reassured me that I would not be fired, at least not immediately, but it had also confirmed that my actions had created professional complications that extended beyond my personal life. I was now the forensic accountant who had turned in her own parents, and that label would follow me regardless of how justified my actions had been or how overwhelming the evidence was. Over the next several weeks, I discovered just how pervasive that label had become. Friends I had known since university stopped returning my calls. Acquaintances unfriended me on social media. A book club I had been part of for 3 years sent me a polite email explaining that several members were uncomfortable with my presence given the circumstances, and perhaps it would be best if I took some time away from the group. My yoga instructor, Someone I had taken classes from for years asked me not to return to the studio because other clients had complained about my presence, making them feel uneasy. The rejection was not always overt or direct. Sometimes it manifested as suddenly busy schedules, unreturned messages, invitations that mysteriously got lost in the mail. People I had considered friends simply faded out of my life without explanation or confrontation, choosing distance over the discomfort of associating with someone who had become controversial and complicated. I understood the impulse even as it hurt. Nobody wants to be connected to a person who represents difficult moral questions about family loyalty and whistleblowing and the cost of doing the right thing. It is easier to maintain relationships with people whose choices are simple and whose lives do not require you to examine your own values and priorities. The only person from my former social circle who did not abandon me was my college roommate Jessica, who called me 2 weeks after the arraignment and said simply, "I am taking you to dinner tonight and I am not accepting no for an answer." We met at a Thai restaurant in the Mission District, and for the first time since everything had fallen apart, I found myself sitting across from someone who did not look at me with judgment or discomfort or carefully masked disapproval. "So," Jessica said after we had ordered our food, "are you okay? And I want a real answer, not the polite reassurance you have probably been giving everyone else." "I am not okay," I admitted. "I feel like I am living in some alternate reality where everything I thought I knew about my life turned out to be false. My parents are criminals. My entire extended family hates me. Most of my friends have disappeared. I go to work and do my job and come home and sit in my apartment alone and wonder if I made the right choice even though I know logically that I did. So no, I am not okay. But I am surviving, which I guess is the best I can hope for right now." Jessica reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You did the right thing. I know that does not make it easier, but it is important that you remember that. Your parents defrauded people. They hurt families who trusted them. They committed crimes repeatedly over decades. None of that changes just because they are your parents. You held them accountable, which is exactly what you should have done." "My grandmother sent me a message saying I am cursed and she never wants to see me again," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "My aunt told me I have brought shame on the family. My cousin said I am a traitor to my own blood. How do I reconcile believing I did the right thing with knowing that everyone I am related to thinks I committed an unforgivable sin?" "You reconcile it by understanding that cultural values around family loyalty are not more important than preventing ongoing harm to innocent people," Jessica said firmly. "Your family is asking you to prioritize their comfort and reputation over justice for the hundreds of families your parents defrauded. They are asking you to be complicit in crimes that ruined lives. That is not a reasonable request, Elena. It does not matter if it is wrapped in language about filial piety or cultural tradition or family cohesion. Wrong is wrong regardless of who is doing it." "I know that intellectually," I said. "But emotionally it feels like I have lost everything. Like I traded my entire identity and support system for the abstract concept of justice. And I am not sure that trade was worth it." Jessica was quiet for a moment. "Then you need to build a new identity and a new support system. You need to find people who share your values, who believe that integrity matters more than convenience, who will stand by you when you do difficult things for the right reasons. Those people exist, Elena. I am one of them. But you have to be open to finding others and letting them into your life." The food arrived and we ate mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable silence rather than an awkward one. Just having someone sit with me who did not need me to explain or justify or defend my choices was healing in ways I had not fully appreciated until that moment. Jessica did not fix anything or make the pain go away, but she reminded me that I was not as alone as I felt, that at least one person from my former life had chosen to stay rather than fade away. When we finished dinner and walked out into the cool San Francisco evening, Jessica hugged me tightly and said, "Call me whenever you need to talk. Day or night, I do not care. You are going to get through this, Elena. It is going to be hard and it is going to hurt, but you are going to survive it and eventually you are going to build something better than what you lost." I wanted to believe her, but in that moment all I could feel was the weight of isolation and the aching absence of the family I had known. I returned to my apartment that night and sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about the choices that had brought me to this point and wondering if there would ever come a day when I did not question whether I had done the right thing. The answer to that question came from an unexpected source 3 weeks later. I was working late at the office, finishing a report that needed to be submitted the next morning, when I received an email to my work address from someone named Patricia Nguyen. The subject line read, "Thank you for your courage." I almost deleted it as spam, but something made me open it instead. The email was long and detailed. Patricia Nguyen explained that she and her husband had purchased a house from Chen Development Corporation 8 years ago. It was their first home, bought with a down payment they had saved over years of working multiple jobs and cutting every possible expense. They had been so proud to own property, to have a place that belonged to them, to be able to raise their 2 young children in a neighborhood with good schools and parks. Within 2 years, problems began appearing. Cracks in the foundation, water leaking through walls during rainstorms, electrical issues that kept triggering circuit breakers, mold growing in the bathroom that would not go away no matter how much they cleaned. They had hired inspectors who confirmed that the house had been built with substandard materials and improper construction methods. The repairs would cost more than $100,000, money they absolutely did not have. Patricia's email continued with details about how the house problems had consumed their lives. Her husband had taken a second job to pay for repairs. She had stopped taking online classes toward finishing her degree because they could not afford the tuition anymore. Their children slept in sleeping bags in the living room because the bedrooms had mold that was making them sick. They had tried to sell the house but could not find buyers once inspection reports revealed the extent of the problems. They were trapped in a house that was literally making their family ill, watching their investment lose value every month, drowning in debt from trying to fix problems that should never have existed. When she heard on the news that Chun Development Corporation's owners had been arrested for fraud, Patricia wrote, she had started crying in the middle of the grocery store. Not because she was happy about my parents going to jail, but because someone had finally validated what she and her husband had known for years. They were not bad homeowners who had failed to maintain their property properly, as my parents' lawyers had suggested when they tried to pursue legal action. They were victims of deliberate fraud, people who had been sold a house that was fundamentally unsafe and unsound, people whose trust had been exploited for profit. The email concluded with a paragraph that I read 3 times, committing every word to memory. I know you are being criticized for reporting your own parents. I have seen some of the comments online and in news articles. People are calling you disloyal and saying family should come first. But I want you to know that you saved my family. Not from our current situation, which cannot be fixed, but from the endless doubt and self-blame we felt about whether we had somehow caused these problems through our own failures. You validated our experience. You confirmed that we were not crazy or incompetent but genuinely harmed. And you stopped your parents from doing this to more families. That matters more than I can possibly express. You are a hero, Miss Chun. Regardless of what your family says about you, you chose justice over loyalty, and that choice protected people like me and my husband and our children. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for caring more about strangers than about protecting criminals who happen to be your parents. I sat at my desk reading Patricia Nguyen's email and felt something shift inside me. The isolation and rejection and constant questioning of my choices had made me focus entirely on what I had lost. I had spent weeks thinking about my grandmother's curse and my family's hatred and the friends who had disappeared from my life. But Patricia's email reminded me of what my actions had accomplished. My parents' fraud had been exposed. The systematic crimes that had harmed hundreds of families had been stopped. And people like Patricia Nguyen, people whose lives had been damaged by my parents' greed, finally had validation and the possibility of justice. That validation mattered more than my family's approval. It mattered more than maintaining relationships with people who valued loyalty over integrity. It mattered more than avoiding the discomfort and isolation that came with making difficult choices for moral reasons. I responded to Patricia's email, thanking her for reaching out and for sharing her story. I told her that her words meant more to me than she could possibly know, that they reminded me why I had made the choices I made, that they gave me strength to continue moving forward despite the personal cost. We exchanged several more emails over the following weeks, and eventually we met for coffee. Patricia was in her late 30s, a small woman with tired eyes, and the kind of determination that comes from surviving circumstances that should have broken you but somehow did not. She told me more about her family's struggles, about the years of watching their home deteriorate, while they worked themselves to exhaustion trying to afford repairs. She told me about other families in their development who were facing similar problems, about an informal support group they had formed to share information and resources. And she told me something that changed how I understood my role in this entire situation. The prosecutor contacted me last week, Patricia said. They want me to testify at your parents' trial if it goes to trial. They want me to explain what it was like to buy our house, what promises were made, what problems we discovered, how it affected our lives. I am terrified to do it. I am not good at public speaking, and I do not want my family's struggles to be examined by lawyers in a courtroom. But I am going to do it anyway because you did something much scarier. You testified against your own parents. If you could find that courage, I can find the courage to testify against people who hurt my family even though they were strangers to me. That conversation with Patricia helped me understand that my actions had created ripples extending far beyond my own experience. By reporting my parents, I had not just held two criminals accountable. I had validated the experiences of hundreds of victims who had been gaslit and blamed for problems they did not create. I had given those victims language and evidence to pursue their own justice. And I had demonstrated that courage was possible even when the cost was enormous, which gave other people permission to be brave in their own circumstances. The isolation I felt was real and painful, but it was not the whole story. Yes, I had lost my family and many of my friends. Yes, I had become controversial and complicated and difficult to associate with. But I had also gained something unexpected. I had gained clarity about my own values and priorities. I had gained relationships with people like Patricia who shared those values and respected difficult choices made for moral reasons. And I had gained the knowledge that I was capable of doing the right thing even when it cost me everything, which was a kind of strength I had not known I possessed. The weeks following that realization were still difficult, but they felt different somehow. The loneliness remained, but it was accompanied by a growing sense of purpose. I was not just surviving the aftermath of my choices. I was building something new from the ruins of my old life. I was becoming someone I could respect, someone who valued integrity over comfort and justice over convenience, someone whose actions matched their stated beliefs. My parents' trial was scheduled for June, 4 months after their initial arraignment. The prosecution was preparing a comprehensive case that would require weeks of testimony and hundreds of pieces of evidence. I was informed that I would need to testify, probably for several days, explaining how I had discovered the fraud and what the evidence demonstrated. The thought of sitting in a courtroom while my parents stared at me with hatred was terrifying. But it was also necessary. Patricia and dozens of other victims would be testifying about the harm they had suffered. I needed to testify about the systematic nature of the crimes and the elaborate structures my parents had created to hide their activities. But that trial was still months away. In the meantime, I focused on work and slowly began rebuilding some version of a social life. Jessica introduced me to some of her friends who worked in nonprofit advocacy and legal aid, people who understood complicated moral situations and did not flinch away from difficulty. I joined a support group for people who had become estranged from their families for ethical reasons, and discovered that I was not as unique as I had felt. There were other people who had reported parents for crimes, who had cut ties with abusive relatives, who had chosen their own values over family loyalty. Hearing their stories and sharing my own created a sense of community that I had not experienced since losing my extended family. I also started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma and moral injury, someone who could help me process the complex emotions of doing something right that felt terrible. Through our sessions, I began to understand that grief for the family I had lost and pride in the choices I had made were not contradictory feelings. Both could be true simultaneously. I could mourn the relationships that had been destroyed while also recognizing that those relationships had been built on false foundations that could not have survived the revelation of truth, regardless of how that revelation came about. By April, nearly 3 months after the arraignment, I had achieved something resembling equilibrium. The isolation was still present but no longer felt unbearable. The rejection from my family still hurt but no longer made me question whether I had made the right choice. I had lost my old life completely and irrevocably, but I was slowly building a new one based on values I had chosen consciously rather than inherited automatically. And then my father's lawyer called and asked if I would be willing to meet with my father privately before the trial. "He wants to talk to you," the lawyer said. "He asked me to arrange a meeting where you could speak without prosecutors or other attorneys present. It would not be recorded and nothing said in the meeting could be used in legal proceedings. He just wants a chance to talk to his daughter one more time." I should have said no immediately. There was no possible good that could come from meeting with my father. But some part of me, the part that still remembered being a child who loved her parents and believed they were good people, wanted to hear what he would say. Wanted to know if there would be any acknowledgement of wrongdoing, any expression of remorse, any indication that the people who raised me retained some capacity for recognizing their own moral failures. So against my better judgment and despite the advice of nearly everyone I consulted, I agreed to meet with my father one time. That meeting would prove to be one of the most painful experiences of my entire life, but it would also provide the final confirmation that I needed, that my choices had been not just right but necessary. But that is a story for another time. For now, the isolation that had defined the weeks after the arraignment was beginning to transform into something else. Not healing exactly, because some wounds do not heal so much as they scar. But transformation. Growth. The slow, painful process of becoming someone new. Someone forged in the fire of difficult choices and their consequences. Someone who had learned that integrity matters more than comfort, and that sometimes the right path is the one that costs you everything you thought you valued. I was becoming that person one difficult day at a time. And while the journey was far from over, I was finally beginning to believe that I would survive it. The meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday afternoon at a neutral location, a conference room in a legal aid office that my father's attorney had arranged. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing a conservative navy suit that I hoped would serve as armor against whatever emotions this encounter would provoke. The conference room was small and sterile, with white walls and a rectangular table surrounded by cheap office chairs. There was a window overlooking a parking lot, and nothing else that could provide distraction or comfort. I sat facing the door and waited, my hands folded on the table to hide their trembling. My father arrived exactly on time, escorted by his attorney, a tall man in his 50s named Richard Brennan, who had a reputation for defending wealthy clients accused of white-collar crimes. My father looked smaller than I remembered, thinner and older, as though the past 3 months had aged him by years. He wore a suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a month, but it hung slightly loose on his frame, suggesting weight loss or perhaps just the physical manifestation of stress. His face was drawn and there were dark circles under his eyes that no amount of expensive skincare could conceal. He sat down across from me while his attorney remained standing near the door, far enough away to provide the illusion of privacy, while still being present to ensure nothing inappropriate was said. For a long moment, neither my father nor I spoke. We simply looked at each other across the small table. Two people who shared DNA and history, but had become strangers through choices and consequences that could never be undone. "Elena," my father finally said, his voice hoarse as though he had been crying or shouting or perhaps both. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know you had no obligation to do so and I appreciate that you came." I nodded but did not speak. I had decided before arriving that I would let him lead this conversation, that I would not make this easier for him by filling silences or offering reassurances. He had asked for this meeting. He could explain what he wanted from it. My father cleared his throat and looked down at his hands, which were clasped tightly on the table. "The attorney said this conversation cannot be used in court, that nothing I say here can be held against me in the legal proceedings. Is that your understanding as well?" "That is my understanding," I confirmed. "This conversation is private and off the record." "Good," my father said. "Because I need to talk to you not as a defendant to a witness but as a father to a daughter. I need you to understand some things before the trial begins and this situation becomes completely irreparable." I waited, saying nothing, watching him struggle to find words for whatever he had come here to say. "Your mother and I, we came to America with nothing," my father began, his voice taking on a storytelling quality as though he were recounting a familiar narrative he had told many times before. "We worked terrible jobs for terrible pay. We saved every dollar. We sacrificed everything to build something for our family, to create opportunities that we never had. Do you remember me telling you about the first development project we did? The small townhouse complex in Fremont?" I remember I said quietly, "We borrowed money from everyone we knew to make that project happen. We took risks that could have destroyed us financially if anything went wrong. And things did go wrong, Elena. Contractors overcharged us. Materials cost more than estimated. The timeline stretched out much longer than planned. We were hemorrhaging money and we were facing bankruptcy if we could not complete that project and sell those units." He paused, seeming to gather himself for what came next. We made compromises to survive. We used less expensive materials than originally planned. We cut corners on things that seemed minor at the time. We told ourselves it was temporary, that once we had more financial stability we would do things properly. But those initial compromises became habits. The shortcuts became standard practice. And over time we convinced ourselves that everyone in the real estate development business operated this way, that the margins were too thin to do things by the book and still make a profit, that we were not really doing anything wrong because we were just doing what everyone else did. I listened to this explanation with a growing sense of anger. My father was attempting to justify decades of systematic fraud by framing it as survival instincts and industry norms. He was trying to make me believe that what he and my mother had done was understandable given their circumstances, that anyone in their position would have made similar choices. Dad, I interrupted, keeping my voice level despite the fury building in my chest. You are talking about your first project 30 years ago. Maybe I could understand compromises made under financial pressure when you were just starting out and desperate to survive. But the fraud I documented was ongoing. You and Mom were multimillionaires. You owned a mansion and luxury cars and investment properties. You were not struggling to survive. You were wealthy people who continued to defraud working families because it was more profitable than doing things honestly. That is not survival. That is greed. My father's face hardened. You do not understand how business works. You have never built anything. You have never taken risks or dealt with the pressures of managing a company and keeping employees paid and navigating competitive markets. It is easy to judge from your position, as someone who just examines other people's financial records and criticizes their choices. But you have no idea what it actually takes to build wealth in America. I have examined thousands of financial records for hundreds of companies, I said coldly. I know exactly what it takes to build legitimate wealth because I have seen countless examples of people doing it honestly. What you and Mom did was not normal business practice. It was systematic criminal fraud. You falsified inspection reports. You bribed officials. You used shell companies to hide assets and evade taxes. Those are not gray areas or understandable compromises. Those are deliberate crimes. My father slammed his hand on the table, making me flinch despite my intention to remain calm. We gave you everything. He shouted, his composure cracking completely. We paid for your private school education. We paid for Stanford. We gave you opportunities we never had. And this is how you repay us? By destroying our lives? By sending us to prison? What kind of daughter does that? The kind of daughter who values justice over loyalty to criminals, I said quietly. The kind of daughter who cannot watch innocent families suffer, so her parents can maintain a lifestyle built on fraud. The kind of daughter who believes that doing the right thing matters more than protecting family members from the consequences of their own choices. My father stared at me with an expression that was equal parts rage and disbelief. Your grandmother was right about you. She said you were cursed, that you had lost your soul to American individualism and forgotten what it means to be part of a Chinese family. We should have sent you back to Taiwan when you were young, made sure you learned proper values instead of this Western obsession with abstract morality that matters more to you than your own flesh and blood. The words stung more than I wanted to admit, but I forced myself to remain composed. If proper values means protecting criminals because they are family, then I am glad I learned Western morality instead. If being part of a Chinese family means I am supposed to stay silent while you and Mom hurt hundreds of people, then maybe I do not want to be part of that family. Culture and tradition do not excuse crime, Dad. They do not make fraud acceptable just because the perpetrators are your parents. We could have given you everything, my father said, his voice dropping to something that was almost pleading. If you had just joined the company like we wanted, if you had worked with us instead of against us, you would have been wealthy beyond anything you could achieve as an accountant. You could have had a real career, real success, real power. Instead, you chose this righteous crusade that has destroyed your family and isolated you from everyone who ever cared about you. Was it worth it, Elena? Was destroying us worth losing everything else? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications and accusations. My father was trying to make me doubt my choices by emphasizing their cost, trying to convince me that the price I had paid was too high to justify the outcome I had achieved. It was a manipulation tactic that might have worked if I had not spent the past 3 months processing exactly these questions with my therapist and through painful personal reflection. Yes, I said simply. It was worth it. Not because I wanted to destroy you or because I enjoy being isolated from my family, but because Patricia Nguyen and her family deserved better than the house you sold them. Because the Martinez family deserved better than watching their home fall apart while you drove luxury cars. Because every single family you defrauded deserved honesty and safety, and the home they thought they were buying. Your question assumes that my relationship with you and Mom should matter more than justice for hundreds of innocent people. I reject that assumption completely. My father's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, anger giving way to something that looked almost like grief. We are your parents, he said quietly. We loved you. We raised you. We gave you life. Does not that count for anything? Counted for a lot, I said, and I felt my own composure starting to crack. It counted for 29 years of believing you were good people who had built success through hard work and integrity. It counted for being proud of my family and wanting to make you proud of me. But then I discovered that everything I believed about you was false. The people I thought you were do not exist. The parents I loved were characters in a story you told me, not the actual people sitting across from me right now. And yes, that hurts more than I can possibly express. But my pain does not obligate me to protect you from accountability for your crimes. There was a long silence. My father's attorney shifted uncomfortably near the door but did not intervene. My father himself seemed to be struggling with something internal, his face working through emotions that he was trying unsuccessfully to hide. The prosecutor offered us a plea deal, my father said finally, his voice flat and emotionless. If we plead guilty to reduce charges and cooperate in prosecuting the contractors and officials who were involved in the scheme, they will recommend a sentence of 5 to 7 years instead of the 30 years we are facing if convicted at trial. My attorney thinks we should take the deal. He says the evidence against us is overwhelming, and we have no realistic chance of winning at trial. Your evidence, he added bitterly. The documentation you compiled is apparently so thorough and well organized that there is no credible defense we can mount against it. I said nothing, waiting to see where this was going. We have not decided yet whether to accept the deal, my father continued. Your mother wants to fight the charges. She believes we can convince a jury that we were just trying to run a successful business, and that any problems with the houses were the result of contractor incompetence rather than our deliberate choices. She thinks we can make the jury see us as victims of an ungrateful daughter who fabricated evidence out of spite. But I am not sure that is true. I think the evidence is what you say it is. I think we did the things you documented. And I think if we go to trial we will be convicted and we will die in prison. He looked at me directly, and I saw something in his eyes that might have been genuine emotion or might have been calculated manipulation. If we take the plea deal and go to prison for 5 to 7 years, we will come out in our early 70s. We will have lost everything, our company and our assets and our reputation, but we will still have some life left to live. But before we make that decision, before we accept that outcome, I needed to know if there was any possibility of you changing your testimony. If there was any chance that you might have made mistakes in your analysis, that perhaps some of the evidence could be interpreted differently, that maybe your conclusions were influenced by your anger at us for not supporting your career choices. I stared at my father in complete disbelief. You asked me to come here so you could try to convince me to commit perjury? So you could persuade me to change my testimony and pretend I made errors in my analysis? That is why you wanted this meeting. Not perjury, my father said quickly. Just reconsidering your interpretation of ambiguous evidence. Just acknowledging that there might be alternative explanations for the patterns you identified. Just being open to the possibility that you reached conclusions based on assumptions rather than definitive proof. The evidence is definitive, I said coldly. Your signature on documents creating shell companies is not ambiguous. Wire transfers from your business accounts to those shell companies are not open to alternative interpretation. Emails between you and contractors discussing kickback schemes are not based on assumptions. You committed crimes, Dad. Extensive, systematic, documented crimes. And no amount of reframing or alternative interpretation can change those facts. My father leaned back in his chair, his face closing off completely. Then this meeting is over. I wanted to give you a chance to make this right, to undo some of the damage you have caused to this family. But I see now that you are completely committed to destroying us regardless of the cost to yourself. You are going to spend the rest of your life regretting this choice, Elena. When your mother and I are in prison and you are alone with no family and no support, you are going to realize that you valued your abstract principles more than the people who loved you. And by then it will be too late to fix what you broke." He stood up and walked toward the door where his attorney was waiting. I remained seated, watching him leave, feeling a complex mixture of emotions that I could not fully sort through in that moment. Sadness at the finality of this conversation, at the confirmation that my father felt no genuine remorse for his crimes, and saw himself primarily as a victim of my betrayal. Anger at his attempt to manipulate me into changing my testimony. Relief that I had held firm, and not allowed him to undermine my certainty about the rightness of my choices. And underneath all of that, a deep grief for the relationship we had once had and would never have again. Before my father reached the door, I spoke one last time. "Dad," I said quietly, and he stopped but did not turn around. "I am not the one who broke this family. You and Mom did that when you chose fraud over integrity, when you chose wealth over honesty, when you chose to hurt innocent people for profit. I just refuse to be complicit in protecting you from the consequences of those choices. If you go to prison, it will be because of what you did, not because of what I reported. I hope someday you understand that distinction." My father did not respond. He walked out of the conference room with his attorney, and the door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded far too quiet for such a definitive ending. I sat alone in that sterile room for several minutes, processing what had just happened and what it meant for the path ahead. My father had given me one last chance to doubt myself, to question whether I had been too harsh or too unforgiving, to wonder if family loyalty should have trumped my commitment to justice. But instead, the meeting had accomplished exactly the opposite. It had confirmed that my parents viewed themselves as victims rather than perpetrators, that they felt entitled to escape accountability through manipulation and reframing, that they had learned nothing from being caught, and would continue justifying their behavior indefinitely. That clarity was painful but also liberating. I no longer needed to wonder if there was some part of my parents that recognized their wrongdoing and felt genuine remorse. I no longer needed to hope for reconciliation or redemption, or even basic acknowledgement of the harm they had caused. They were who they had always been, people who valued success and wealth above integrity, and who would sacrifice anyone, including their own daughter, to protect themselves from consequences. The only difference now was that I could see them clearly instead of through the distorting lens of childhood love and cultural conditioning about parental authority. I left the conference room and walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight feeling something I had not felt since the initial arraignment. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of peace that came from no longer carrying uncertainty about whether I had made the right choice. My father had tried one last time to manipulate me into complicity, and I had refused. That refusal felt like the final severing of ties that had been fraying since the moment I discovered the truth about their crimes. I was no longer their daughter in any meaningful sense. I was a witness in a criminal case, a forensic accountant who had documented fraud, a person who had chosen justice over family, and would live with the consequences of that choice without regret or doubt. The weeks following that meeting passed in a strange suspended state. I met with prosecutors to prepare for testimony. I attended therapy sessions and support groups and slowly expanding social gatherings with the new people in my life. I learned through my father's attorney that my parents had accepted the plea deal, which meant there would be no trial. They would plead guilty to conspiracy to commit fraud and tax evasion in exchange for the prosecution dropping the more serious racketeering charges. The sentencing was scheduled for early June. I would not need to testify after all, which was both a relief and somehow a disappointment. I had been preparing myself to face my parents in court, to present the evidence publicly, to ensure that what they had done was documented in a permanent public record. The plea deal meant that process would be abbreviated. The full scope of their crimes condensed into a brief court proceeding where they would admit guilt and accept punishment without requiring victims to relive their trauma through testimony. Patricia Nguyen called me when she heard about the plea deal. Her voice was thick with emotion that I recognized as disappointment mixed with relief. "I wanted to testify," she said. "I wanted to look them in the eye and tell them what they did to my family. I wanted them to hear directly from me about the mold in my children's bedroom, and the cracks in our foundation and the financial devastation we experienced trying to fix problems we did not cause. But I am also glad I do not have to do it, if that makes any sense. I am glad I do not have to take time off work and arrange childcare, and sit in a courtroom while lawyers question every detail of my life and my choices. I am glad this will be over soon so we can start trying to move forward. I understand completely, I told her. The plea deal means they are accepting responsibility, at least legally if not emotionally. That matters even if you do not get to confront them directly. And the restitution fund that is part of the plea agreement will provide some financial compensation for families who were affected by their fraud. It is not everything you deserve, but it is something. Are you okay with not testifying? Patricia asked. I know you prepared for months to present your evidence in court. Does it feel anticlimactic to have it end this way? I thought about her question carefully. A little, I admitted. But mostly I am relieved. Testifying would have required me to sit in the same room as my parents for days or weeks, to have them stare at me while I explained in detail how I discovered and documented their crimes, to endure their attorneys attempting to discredit my work and my motivations. I prepared myself to do it because it was necessary, but I am not disappointed that it is no longer required. The outcome is the same either way. They are going to prison for their crimes. Justice is being served even without the public spectacle of a trial. Patricia was quiet for a moment. My husband asked me last night if I thought you ever regretted reporting your parents. He wondered if you wished you had just let it go, kept the information to yourself, maintained your family relationships. I told him I did not think you regretted it because if you were the kind of person who could stay silent about something like this, you never would have reported them in the first place. Was I right? You were right, I said softly. I do not regret reporting them. I regret that they committed crimes. I regret that they hurt so many people. I regret that my childhood was built on a foundation of lies and exploitation. I regret that I do not have parents I can respect or maintain relationships with. But I do not regret exposing the truth and ensuring they face consequences. That was the only choice I could live with regardless of its cost. We talked for a few more minutes about practical matters, about the restitution fund procedures and whether Patricia's family would qualify for compensation. Before we hung up, Patricia said something that would stay with me long after the conversation ended. You know what gives me hope? She said. Knowing that there are people like you in the world, people who will do the right thing even when it costs them everything. People who value integrity over comfort. My children need to grow up knowing that those people exist, that courage is real and not just something we talk about in abstract terms. You showed them that through your choices, Elena. Whatever happens next in your life, you should remember that you gave a lot of people hope by demonstrating that justice is possible, even when it seems impossibly difficult. The sentencing hearing was held on June 12 in the same courthouse where the arraignment had taken place 5 months earlier. I attended despite having no official role in the proceedings, sitting in the back row of the gallery and watching as my parents were led into the courtroom by federal marshals. They looked diminished and defeated, wearing the orange jumpsuits of pretrial detainees because they had been held without bail since accepting the plea deal. My mother's face was bare of makeup and her hair hung limp around her shoulders. My father had lost even more weight and his shoulders hunched forward as though he were trying to make himself smaller and less visible. The hearing itself was procedural and brief. The judge reviewed the terms of the plea agreement, confirmed that my parents understood the charges they were pleading guilty to, and the rights they were waiving by accepting the deal. The prosecutor read a summary of their crimes into the record, describing the systematic fraud spanning decades and affecting hundreds of families. My parents were required to allocate, which meant they had to describe their crimes in their own words and admit responsibility. My father spoke in a monotone, reciting a carefully prepared statement that acknowledged engaging in fraudulent business practices without expressing any genuine remorse or understanding of the harm caused. My mother said even less, barely audible as she confirmed that she had participated in the schemes her husband described. Then it was time for victims to speak. The judge had allowed 3 families to present impact statements describing how my parents' fraud had affected their lives. Patricia Nguyen was one of those families. I watched her walk to the podium, a small woman in a conservative dress that looked slightly too large on her thin frame. She read from a prepared statement, her voice shaking but determined, describing what it had been like to purchase what she thought was her dream home, only to discover it was a nightmare of structural problems and health hazards. She talked about her children sleeping in sleeping bags in the living room because their bedrooms had mold. She talked about her husband working 2 full-time jobs trying to pay for repairs they could not afford. She talked about the shame and self-blame they felt before learning that their problems were not their fault, but the result of deliberate fraud. When Patricia finished and returned to her seat, I saw tears on her face but also something like relief. She had been heard. Her suffering had been acknowledged in an official record that would exist permanently. That validation could not undo the damage to her home or her finances, but it mattered nonetheless. The other two families told similar stories with different specific details. Houses falling apart despite supposedly being new construction. Savings depleted trying to fix problems that should never have existed. Children developing respiratory problems from mold and other environmental hazards. Marriages strained by financial pressure, and the constant stress of living in unstable housing. Each story was a testament to the real human cost of my parents' crimes. The lives disrupted and damaged and diminished by their choice to prioritize profit over safety. When the victim statements concluded, the judge looked at my parents and delivered a speech about the seriousness of their crimes and the importance of sending a message that such behavior would not be tolerated. Then she announced the sentence. 7 years in federal prison for each of them, to be served concurrently with credit for time already served. They would be eligible for early release after serving approximately 5 years, if they demonstrated good behavior. Upon release, they would be required to complete 3 years of supervised probation, and were permanently prohibited from working in real estate development or any position requiring a state contractor's license. The restitution fund would be funded by the liquidation of essentially all their assets, with the proceeds distributed to affected homeowners, according to formulas that would be determined by the court. My parents were led out of the courtroom to begin serving their sentences. My mother looked back once as she was walking through the door, and her eyes found mine in the gallery. The hatred in that look was so pure and intense that I felt it like a physical blow. Then she was gone, disappeared behind heavy doors that closed with a finality that echoed through the silent courtroom. I sat there for several minutes after everyone else had left, alone in that space where my parents had been sentenced to prison largely because of evidence I had provided. I waited to feel something dramatic, some sense of triumph or vindication or closure. But what I actually felt was mostly exhaustion mixed with a quiet sadness. I had done what needed to be done. Justice had been served in the limited ways that legal systems can serve justice. My parents would spend years in prison, and would emerge into a world where their wealth and status had been stripped away. The families they had harmed would receive some financial compensation, even if it could never fully repair the damage that had been done. It was over. This chapter of my life defined by discovery and investigation and prosecution and family destruction. My parents were convicted criminals who would serve time for their crimes. I was the daughter who had reported them, forever marked by that choice in ways I was still learning to understand and accept. The cost had been everything I thought I valued about my identity and belonging. The gain had been integrity and justice and the knowledge that I was capable of doing difficult things for moral reasons. Walking out of that courthouse into the warm June afternoon, I felt something shifting inside me. Not healing exactly because some wounds are too deep to heal completely, but transformation. I was not the same person who had walked into that forensic accounting assignment 6 months ago. Not the same woman who had believed her parents were respectable philanthropists, not the same daughter who had valued family harmony above all else. I had become someone harder and stronger and more certain about what mattered. I had learned that courage means acting according to your values, even when the cost is devastating. I had discovered that integrity is not something you have in abstract but something you demonstrate through choices that no one else can make for you. The future stretched ahead of me, uncertain and lonely, but also somehow full of possibility. I would build a new life from the ruins of the old one. I would find community among people who shared my values rather than people who shared my blood. I would use my skills and experience to continue fighting against fraud and exploitation, wherever I encountered it. And I would carry with me always the knowledge that I had been tested in the most fundamental way possible, and I had not failed that test. I had chosen justice over comfort, truth over loyalty, integrity over belonging. That choice had cost me my family, but it had given me something more valuable. It had given me myself. The weeks following the sentencing felt suspended in time, as though I were living in the space between one life ending and another beginning, but had not yet figured out how to fully inhabit either reality. I returned to work at Morrison & Associates the day after my parents were sentenced, walking into the office with the same routine I had maintained for years, but everything felt different in ways I could not quite articulate. My colleagues treated me with a mixture of respect and uncertainty, as though they were proud of what I had done, but also unsure how to interact with someone who had just sent her own parents to prison. Thomas Morrison called me into his office on my third day back. He gestured for me to sit in the familiar leather chair across from his desk and studied me carefully before speaking. "Elena," he began, his voice carrying the measured tone he used for serious conversations, "I want to check in with you about how you are doing and what you want for your career going forward. You have been through an extraordinarily difficult experience over the past 6 months, and I would understand completely if you needed to take some time away from work to process everything that has happened. We can arrange a leave of absence if that would be helpful." "I appreciate the offer," I said, meaning it genuinely. "But honestly, work is the one part of my life that still feels normal and stable. I need the structure and the intellectual challenge. Taking time off would just leave me alone with my thoughts, which is not actually helpful right now. I would rather be here doing what I am trained to do." Thomas nodded slowly. "I understand that impulse. Work can be healing when everything else feels chaotic. But I also want to make sure you are not using work as a way to avoid processing difficult emotions that will eventually need to be addressed, whether you are ready for them or not." "I am seeing a therapist twice a week," I assured him. "I am not avoiding the emotional work. I am just choosing to maintain professional productivity while also doing that personal processing. The two things are not mutually exclusive." "Fair enough," Thomas said. "Then let me shift to the other reason I wanted to talk with you. Your work on the Chun Development Corporation case, the thoroughness of your investigation and the quality of your documentation, has attracted attention from several potential clients. We have been contacted by 3 different law firms in the past 2 weeks, asking specifically if you would be available to work on cases involving construction fraud and real estate development schemes. Apparently word has spread in the legal community that you are exceptional at untangling complex corporate structures and identifying patterns of systematic fraud." I felt something stir in my chest that might have been pride or purpose or simply relief that my professional reputation had survived intact despite the personal controversy. "That is good to hear," I said carefully. "I was worried that what happened with my parents might make clients uncomfortable about working with me." "Some clients are uncomfortable," Thomas admitted. "We did lose 2 accounts because those clients did not want to be associated with someone involved in such a public family conflict. But we have gained 3 new accounts specifically because of your work, and those new clients are pursuing cases with significantly higher fees than the accounts we lost. From a pure business perspective, your involvement in prosecuting your parents has been a net positive for the firm. But more importantly, it has established you as someone with extraordinary integrity and capabilities. Lawyers want to work with forensic accountants they can trust completely, people who will not compromise their analysis for political or personal reasons. You demonstrated those qualities in the most dramatic way possible." He paused, then continued, "I am offering you a promotion to director level, which comes with a substantial salary increase and the opportunity to lead your own cases rather than working as part of larger teams. You would have autonomy to choose which cases you take, and to build your own specialized practice focusing on whatever areas of forensic accounting interest you most. I think you have earned this promotion through your exceptional work over the past 3 years, and the timing feels right given the new opportunities that are emerging. What do you think?" I sat in that chair processing what Thomas had just offered me. A director-level position at 29 years old was remarkable, the kind of advancement that usually took a decade or more to achieve. The salary increase would transform my financial situation from comfortable to genuinely secure. The autonomy to choose cases would allow me to focus on work that felt meaningful, rather than simply accepting whatever assignments came through the door. This was the kind of opportunity one had hoped might eventually come my way, but I had expected it to take many more years of steady progress rather than arriving in the immediate aftermath of the most traumatic period of my life. "I accept," I said, hearing the emotion in my own voice despite my attempt to remain professional. "Thank you for believing in me and for giving me this opportunity. I will not let you down." "I know you will not," Thomas said with a slight smile. "You are constitutionally incapable of letting people down when they trust you with responsibility. That is exactly why I am making this offer. Now go talk to Susan in Human Resources about the paperwork and the details of your new compensation package. And Elena," he added as I stood to leave, "take care of yourself." Professional success matters, but not as much as your well-being. Do not sacrifice the latter for the former. I left his office feeling something I had not felt in months. Hope mixed with purpose. A sense that perhaps the destruction of my old life was creating space for something better to emerge. The promotion was validation that my professional capabilities were recognized and valued, regardless of the personal controversy surrounding my choices. It was proof that integrity and competence could coexist, that doing the right thing did not necessarily mean destroying your career, even if it destroyed your family relationships. Over the next several weeks, I threw myself into work with renewed energy and focus. I took on a case involving a real estate investment trust that had allegedly defrauded elderly investors by misrepresenting property values and diverting funds to personal accounts. The case was complex and required months of detailed analysis, exactly the kind of intellectual challenge that allowed me to use skills I had developed while investigating my parents' crimes. I worked long hours, sometimes staying at the office until midnight, but the work felt purposeful in ways that went beyond simply collecting a paycheck. I was helping to hold powerful people accountable for exploiting vulnerable populations. I was using my training and abilities to pursue justice for people who had been lied to and stolen from. Every document I analyzed and every pattern I identified was a small act of resistance against the kind of systematic fraud my parents had represented. My new position also gave me the authority to make decisions about which cases the firm would accept and which we would decline. I made it a personal policy to prioritize cases involving fraud against working-class and middle-class victims over cases involving disputes between wealthy parties. When a corporate client wanted us to investigate a competitor for potential fraud, but could not articulate how ordinary people were being harmed by the alleged misconduct, I declined the engagement. When a legal aid organization asked if we could provide pro bono services for a group of tenants who believed their landlord was illegally withholding security deposits and manipulating accounting records, I immediately agreed and assigned my best junior associate to work on the case with me. This philosophical approach to case selection was not just about personal values. It was strategic positioning based on my understanding of where the forensic accounting market was moving. Traditional corporate clients were increasingly handling routine accounting disputes with in-house teams or lower-cost service providers. The cases that still required outside forensic accounting expertise were the complex ones involving systematic fraud that harmed consumers or investors or vulnerable populations. By specializing in those cases and building a reputation for taking them seriously even when the victims were not wealthy or powerful, I was creating a niche that differentiated our firm from competitors and attracted exactly the kind of work I found most meaningful. The strategy worked. Within 3 months of my promotion, I had brought in 6 new major cases and established relationships with several nonprofit legal organizations that regularly referred clients who needed forensic accounting expertise. My income increased substantially, but more importantly, my sense of professional purpose deepened. I was not just examining financial records and writing reports. I was part of a larger ecosystem of people working to ensure that legal protections applied equally to everyone regardless of their economic status or social position. This professional transformation was accompanied by gradual rebuilding of my personal life. Jessica remained my closest friend and introduced me to an expanding network of people who worked in social justice fields and understood the complexities of choosing integrity over convenience. I started attending gatherings at her apartment, small dinner parties where lawyers and activists and nonprofit workers would discuss their cases and share strategies, and generally create the kind of intellectual community I had been missing since losing my family connections. At one of these gatherings in late summer, I met a woman named Sarah Huang who worked as a public defender in San Francisco. She was a few years older than me, in her early 30s, with short hair and an intensity that reminded me of Patricia Nguyen. We ended up talking for hours about the criminal justice system and the challenges of representing clients who everyone else had written off as guilty or worthless. Sarah told me about defendants she had represented who were genuinely innocent, but had been convicted anyway because juries believed police testimony over contradictory evidence. She told me about plea deals that her clients accepted not because they were guilty but because the risk of going to trial and receiving decades in prison was too terrifying to contemplate even when they had done nothing wrong. "Your parents took a plea deal," Sarah said at one point in the conversation. "Do you think they were actually guilty, or do you think they just could not risk going to trial?" "They were definitely guilty," I said without hesitation. The evidence was overwhelming and documented. They took the plea deal because fighting the charges would have been futile and would have exposed them to much longer sentences. That is completely different from innocent people accepting plea deals out of fear. But how do you know for certain they were guilty? Sarah pressed. I am not challenging you, I am genuinely asking. You found evidence that looked like fraud. You interpreted that evidence as demonstrating systematic criminal behavior. But could there have been alternative explanations you did not consider? Could your anger at your parents for not supporting your career have influenced your analysis? The question was challenging, but Sarah asked it with genuine curiosity rather than accusation. I thought carefully before answering. I know they were guilty because I am a trained forensic accountant who has examined thousands of financial records, and I know how to distinguish between legitimate business practices and fraud. I know they were guilty because multiple independent investigations by federal prosecutors and FBI agents confirmed every conclusion I reached. I know they were guilty because they ultimately pleaded guilty and admitted in court that they had engaged in the conduct I documented. And I know they were guilty because when I confronted my father privately, he did not deny doing what I accused him of. He just tried to justify it and convince me to change my testimony. Sarah nodded slowly. Okay, that is pretty definitive. I apologize if the question was offensive. I work in a system where certainty is rare and people are convicted based on far less evidence than what you just described. It makes me skeptical about claims of absolute guilt even when those claims seem obvious. I appreciate the skepticism, I said honestly. Questioning assumptions and demanding strong evidence are important disciplines, especially in contexts where people's liberty is at stake. But in this case, the evidence was not ambiguous and my conclusions were not influenced by personal feelings. My parents committed crimes. I documented those crimes. They are in prison because of what they did, not because of how I felt about them. That conversation with Sarah became the foundation for a friendship that would prove crucial to my continued healing. She understood better than most people the complexity of believing in justice, while also recognizing that legal systems are imperfect and sometimes produce unjust outcomes. She helped me think through the difference between my parents' case, where guilt was clear and punishment was appropriate, and other situations where the system failed to distinguish between actual criminality and circumstances that only looked criminal to people who did not understand context. Through our ongoing discussions, I developed a more nuanced understanding of my own actions and their place in a larger landscape of accountability and justice. By October, 6 months after my parents' sentencing, I had achieved something resembling stability in my new life. I had a career I found meaningful and a professional reputation that was growing stronger. I had friends who shared my values and understood my choices. I had financial security and a sense of purpose that came from using my skills to help people who needed them. What I did not have was family, and that absence remained a constant ache that no amount of professional success or new friendships could fully address. The holidays approached with dread I tried unsuccessfully to ignore. This would be the first Thanksgiving and Christmas I would spend without my parents or extended family. In previous years, the holiday season had meant elaborate gatherings at my parents' mansion, multi-course meals prepared by my mother, conversations with aunts and uncles and cousins that were often superficial but still provided a sense of belonging to something larger than myself. Now those gatherings would happen without me, if they happened at all. My parents were in prison. My extended family had made clear I was not welcome at any family events. The holidays that had once been markers of family connection would now be just days that reminded me of everything I had lost. Jessica sensed my anxiety about the approaching holidays and invited me to spend Thanksgiving with her family in Sacramento. I accepted the invitation with genuine gratitude, though I worried about intruding on someone else's family gathering. When the day arrived and I drove to Jessica's parents' house, I was nervous in ways I had not anticipated. I had not spent a holiday with anyone else's family in years. I did not know their traditions or inside jokes or family dynamics. I was an outsider entering intimate space, and the awareness of my outsider status made me hyper-conscious of every word I spoke and every gesture I made. But Jessica's parents, both retired teachers in their 60s, welcomed me with warmth that seemed genuine rather than performed. They asked questions about my work but did not press for details about my family situation. They included me in conversations about local politics and upcoming travel plans, and their concerns about whether Jessica was working too many hours at her nonprofit job. They treated me like a person who belonged at their table rather than a charity case or a controversial figure who required careful handling. By the end of the evening, I felt something I had not felt in months. Safe. Accepted. Part of a community that valued me for who I was rather than judging me for choices I had made. Driving back to San Francisco that night, I found myself crying for reasons I could not fully articulate. Partly grief for the family I no longer had. Partly gratitude for the kindness Jessica's parents had shown me. Partly relief that it was possible to feel belonging again, even after losing the family you were born into. The tears were cleansing rather than painful, releasing emotions I had been holding too tightly for too long. The following weeks brought an unexpected development that would shift my trajectory again. I received a phone call from a woman named Dr. Margaret Reeves who taught in the Business Ethics Department at Stanford University. She explained that she was developing a new course on whistleblowing and ethical decision-making in professional contexts, and she had been following my case through news coverage and court documents. She wanted to know if I would be willing to come speak to her class about my experience, about how I had identified fraud within my own family's business, and what factors had influenced my decision to report rather than remain silent. My initial reaction was to decline immediately. The thought of standing in front of university students and discussing the most painful period of my life felt exposing and uncomfortable. But Dr. Reeves was persistent without being pushy. She explained that her students needed to hear from people who had actually faced difficult ethical dilemmas, rather than just reading about theoretical scenarios in textbooks. She emphasized that my experience was valuable precisely because it was messy and costly, and did not fit neat categories of right versus wrong. She assured me that I would not be required to discuss anything I was uncomfortable sharing, and that the conversation could be structured as an interview, rather than a formal presentation if that felt more manageable. After several days of consideration and a conversation with my therapist about whether this would be helpful or harmful to my healing process, I agreed to speak to Dr. Reeves's class. We scheduled the session for early December, which gave me time to prepare and to think through what I wanted to say about my experience. The day of the talk arrived cold and rainy, typical December weather in Northern California. I drove to Stanford's campus feeling a complicated mixture of nervousness and something that might have been excitement. I had not been back to campus since graduating 7 years ago, and walking through the familiar spaces brought back memories of a version of myself who had been so certain about her path and her identity. That younger Elena had believed her parents were good people who had achieved success through hard work and integrity. She had been proud of her family and eager to make them proud of her. She had no idea that within a few years she would discover everything she believed was false, and would be forced to choose between family loyalty and moral integrity. Dr. Reeves met me outside the classroom building, and walked with me to the seminar room where about 30 students were already seated. She introduced me briefly, providing context about my professional background and explaining that I had been involved in reporting significant financial fraud that had resulted in criminal prosecutions. She did not mention that the perpetrators were my parents, leaving that revelation for me to disclose if and when I felt ready. I stood at the front of the room looking at those 30 students, most of them probably around 20 years old, and wondered what I could possibly say that would be useful to people who had not yet faced the kind of choices that test your fundamental values. But I took a deep breath and began talking, telling my story from the beginning. I explained how I had discovered evidence of fraud while working on an unrelated case. I described the weeks of investigation and the growing realization that my own parents were the perpetrators. I talked about the decision to report what I had found and the consequences that decision had created. I discussed the loss of family relationships and the isolation that followed. And I tried to articulate what I had learned about integrity and courage and the cost of doing the right thing when that thing destroys everything you thought your life was built on. The students listened with attention that felt almost tangible. When I finished the core narrative and opened the floor for questions, hands shot up immediately. A young woman in the front row asked how I had found the strength to report my parents knowing it would destroy my relationship with them. An Asian American student asked how I had dealt with cultural pressures around filial piety and family loyalty. A business major asked whether I thought whistleblowing was always the right choice, or if there were circumstances where protecting institutions or relationships should take priority over exposing wrongdoing. I answered each question as honestly as I could, acknowledging uncertainty where it existed and refusing to present my choices as heroic or simple. I talked about the role my therapist had played in helping me process complicated emotions. I discussed the support I had received from people like Patricia and Gwen, who had been harmed by my parents' fraud. I admitted that there were still days when I questioned whether the price I had paid was worth the outcome I had achieved, even though I believed intellectually that I had made the only choice I could live with. Near the end of the session, a quiet student in the back raised his hand hesitantly. What advice would you give to someone who discovers wrongdoing in their own organization or family? He asked. How do you decide whether to report it or stay silent? I thought carefully before answering. I would say that you have to decide what kind of person you want to be and what values you want to guide your life. If you believe that integrity matters more than comfort, if you believe that preventing harm to innocent people is more important than protecting wrongdoers from consequences, then you already know what you need to do even if you wish you did not know. The decision to report wrongdoing is not about weighing pros and cons on some rational scale where you can calculate the optimal outcome. It is about recognizing that some choices define who you are at your core, and you have to be able to live with the person you see in the mirror regardless of how others judge you. I paused, then added, but I also want to be clear that whistleblowing has real costs, and those costs are not trivial or easily dismissed. I lost my family. I lost most of my friends. I spent months feeling isolated and questioning whether I had made a terrible mistake. Even now, nearly a year later, there are days when I feel the loss acutely and wonder if there was some other path I could have taken. So I am not standing here telling you that doing the right thing is easy or that courage does not hurt. I am telling you that despite those costs, I would make the same choice again because the alternative, staying silent while people I loved hurt others, was not something I could live with. You have to decide for yourself what you can live with and what you cannot. The room was silent for a long moment. Then the students began clapping, and I felt something break open inside me. These young people, most of whom would probably never face choices as dramatic as mine, had listened to my story and had seen it not as a cautionary tale about the costs of integrity, but as an example of courage being possible even when it required sacrificing everything comfortable and familiar. That recognition mattered more than I had expected it to. After the class ended, several students came up to talk with me individually. Some shared their own stories of witnessing wrongdoing in part-time jobs or family businesses, and struggling with whether to say something. Others simply thanked me for being honest about how difficult the right choice had been rather than presenting it as obvious or easy. Dr. Reeves walked me back to my car and asked if I would be willing to speak to other classes in the future, to make this kind of engagement an ongoing part of how I contributed to educating the next generation of business professionals about ethical decision-making. I would be honored, I said, and meant it completely. Talking about my experience in that classroom had been difficult but also strangely healing. It had helped me articulate lessons I had learned through painful experience, and it had reminded me that my story had value beyond my own personal journey. Young people needed to hear from someone who had actually faced moral dilemmas rather than just reading about them in textbooks. They needed to understand that integrity was not abstract but concrete, demonstrated through specific choices that had specific consequences. And they needed to see that courage was possible even for ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. Driving home from Stanford that evening, I felt a shift in how I understood my own narrative. For months I had seen myself primarily as someone who had lost everything, someone defined by absence and grief, and the destruction of family bonds. But that conversation with students had helped me recognize that I was also someone who had gained something valuable through that loss. I had gained clarity about my values and confidence in my ability to act according to those values regardless of cost. I had gained empathy for others facing similar dilemmas, and the ability to offer guidance based on lived experience rather than theory. I had gained a sense of purpose that went beyond my professional work to include a role as educator and example for people who needed to see that doing the right thing was possible, even when it was impossibly hard. The year was ending with my life looking nothing like I had imagined it would 12 months earlier. My parents were in prison. My extended family wanted nothing to do with me. The comfortable identity I had built as a daughter in a successful immigrant family had been completely dismantled. But in the ruins of that old life, something new was emerging. A career focused on pursuing justice for vulnerable people. Friendships based on shared values rather than family obligation. A growing role as someone who could speak with authority about ethical decision-making because I had actually made difficult ethical decisions and lived with their consequences. A version of myself that was harder and stronger and more certain about what mattered than the person I had been before everything fell apart. I was learning that transformation is not just about rebuilding what was destroyed. Sometimes it is about becoming someone entirely different, someone you could not have become without first losing everything you thought defined you. That process was still ongoing and would probably continue for years. But for the first time since discovering my parents' crimes, I felt genuinely hopeful about the person I was becoming and the life I was building from the ashes of the one that had burned down. The future was uncertain, and would undoubtedly bring new challenges and losses. But it would also bring opportunities to continue becoming someone I respected, someone who lived according to values I had chosen consciously rather than inherited automatically. And that possibility, more than any professional success or material comfort, gave me the strength to keep moving forward. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.